I've seen a lot of tears here tonight. But I see no tears in Joanna's eyes. Joanna, you are angry. Tell me why.
Well, yes, I'm angry.
Nothing appears more surprising to those who consider human affairs with a philosophical eye than the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. When we inquire by what means this wonder is effected, we shall find that, as force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. It is therefore on opinion only that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as to the most free and most popular. So in case you hadn't heard, a new Hunger Games novel came out this week, on Tuesday actually, Tuesday the 18th, and this is the 5th novel in the Hunger Games series. It is a prequel focused on the character of Haymitch Abernathy when he's a teenager and his own victory in the Hunger Games about 24-25 years before the events of the first Hunger Games. Now, I just want to say that I was a really big fan of the last Hunger Games novel, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. This is my favorite in the series. I also thoroughly enjoyed the film, which I know is kind of an unpopular take, not to have enjoyed the film, but for it to be your favorite in the series. There's a lot of people, especially millennials, did not like being in the head of such a devious and evil bastard as President Snow. Personally, I thought it was awesome, and also that he was not that evil or devious in the grand scheme of evil and devious narrators, but hey, what do I know? The Hunger Games were coming out when I was in middle school, so I read the books when they were pretty new, and I watched the films as they were released, so it's something near and dear to my heart, and I was really excited for this 5th installment, and I read the whole thing in about a day. Not that it's a very long book, but overall, I would say that I enjoyed it. It was not quite as deep or complex as I was hoping for or expecting, but I still think that there was a lot to unpack here. So let's unpack, yeah? Let's do it together. Okay, so before we get started, the focus of this video is mostly going to be on propaganda, as you may have been able to glean from the title and thumbnail. So we need to first identify what propaganda is, just so we're all on the same page. Otherwise, people in the comments are like, you don't know what, which they're going to do anyway, but whatever. Here's the definition. This is just the top Oxford Dictionary definition that you get from Google, the most basic. Here's what we're using. Propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. There you go. So historically, in the real world and in made-up worlds, like books, propaganda is used to project strength of some kind. And oftentimes to project strength when your actual country or cause or whatever is not very strong. For example, there's this famous image of Mussolini pretending to be a farmer and harvesting, I don't know what this is, grain or something, even though he clearly had never done something like this in his entire life. The most famous example of propaganda, of course, comes from the Leni Riefenstahl films that we saw in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And with figures like Hitler, Riefenstahl, Mussolini, and Stalin in mind, propaganda is typically used derogatorily. Like, you would not refer to something you like or something that you feel is good as propaganda. But is propaganda always negative? And does it always have to be negative? Can propaganda be true? Can propaganda be good? Suzanne Collins, with this novel, clearly says, no, sorry. For example, she begins her novels not only with the quote I began this video with, but also with the following 2 quotes. That all propaganda is lies, even when one is telling the truth. I don't think this matters so long as one knows what one is doing and why. That is a quote from George Orwell. And the following, a truth that's told with bad intent beats all the lies you can invent. That being a quote from William Blake. And yet, the United States has used propaganda effectively and for good. And this is not to say that just because the United States does it, it's good. That's not my point. But I think that kind of the general historical consensus is that Uncle Sam and other recruitment for things like World War II were effective. Rosie the Riveter was effective and did what most of the world would hopefully consider a positive, which is help defeat the Nazis. Not that all of it is so black and white, but I think those are 2 examples that we generally would classify as propaganda and yet not classify as negative. But for Suzanne Collins, propaganda is pretty much exclusively bad, both in this novel and in the other 4 Hunger Games novels. A large focus of this novel that I wasn't expecting is actually on the character of Plutarch Heavensbee, who I feel is kind of an overlooked character. I think he's pretty interesting, and this novel really shows why he's so complex and layered. In this novel, he is a younger guy, he is still rich, and he has status in the capital, but he is not like an A-tier varsity level player. He's just kind of stuck in the worst district, District 12, and is forced to record what goes on there for the reapings and stuff. And yet, he's clearly showing himself to have a deft skill and ability to manipulate crowds and people people in footage, and I think this is really interesting and highlights where he gets a lot of his skills and inspiration from later in the series when he's prominent in Mockingjay. Now, in the third novel, Mockingjay, we have these ideas from Plutarch, these propos, propaganda films that they want to use in order to sell the idea that the rebellion is beating the capital, or that the rebellion is we're joining against the capital. And yet, initially, Plutarch Heavensbee's propos in Mockingjay fail because they aren't true. Katniss isn't an actor. She's not really an inspiring figure unless she's left to her own devices.
Try it again, whenever you're ready.
Katniss cannot lie, and lying, to Collins, is a key aspect of creating effective propaganda. So instead of making propaganda about Katniss, Plutarch and the rest of the rebels eventually realize that they need to make Katniss into the propaganda, specifically into the Mockingjay.
And if we burn, you burn with us!
And this idea of turning people into propaganda, whether it be for good or bad reasons, is really important not just in Mockingjay, but of course also in every other book in the series, from the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes to Sunrise on the Reaping. For example, our main character in this novel, Haymitch Abernathy, begins the book as young, somewhat idealistic, and most importantly, sober.
The refreshments.
So by the end, when Haymitch becomes the raging drunk that we all know and recognize, the reasons for that are much more sinister. He's not just sad about what happened to him in the games, he is made into an alcoholic by Snow, and Snow's murder of his entire family, and all the other ways he's manipulated and made into being what he is through propaganda, through these images that the Capitol wants to project of Haymitch to the Capitol citizens. And this applies to almost all the other characters as well. For example, we have the character of Luella, Haymitch's friend from District 12, who was immediately killed before even entering the arena. So Luella dies, but then is resurrected, as in the Capitol provides her with another girl who looks vaguely like her that's supposed to take her place for the sake and will of the crowds. Then you have the other characters, such as Silka, who is one of the careers from the districts which really cozy up to the Capitol and must always win the Hunger Games. Silka wants to win the Hunger Games so she can be a part of the Capitol, even it is the Capitol's fault that she has to kill all of her friends and go through the terrible things she does in the book, such as losing her eye and eventually being killed by Haymitch. Silka, like all the other careers, become propaganda willingly. The character Finnick Odair from the original trilogy is another great example of this. Even though he ends up being a good guy who fights the Capitol by the end, for most of his life he is a product of the Capitol and a product of the games, so much so that the Capitol literally sells and prostitutes him out to others in order to make more money off of him. He is a product which they have made, not a human who lives under their rule. And then furthermore, we have Coriolanus Snow himself, who as a young man is also somewhat idealistic and has a specific way of wanting to do things in Panem, but eventually he realizes that he cannot beat or change the system, and so instead of trying, he eventually joins it, losing everything that he loves, such as Lucy Gray and his friend Sejanus, in the process. Snow is not forced to turn into propaganda. Snow realizes that he must become propaganda in order to be successful, and so allows himself to be made into the Capitol's image so that he can remake the Capitol in his own image. From this experience, Snow then later learns how to convert such people as Haymitch and even Beatty into pieces of propaganda, as he does in this novel. Because of his experience with Lucy Gray in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, Snow is very aware of Haymitch Abernathy's own relationship with the character of Lenore Dove, who is also Covey just like Lucy Gray was in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Because of this relationship, Snow knows how to expertly manipulate Haymitch and strip everything which he knows, loves, and cares about, because Snow has already done it to himself. Remember in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes when he tries to lie to Lucy Gray by saying that he killed 3 people, one of them being his own self?
My own self.
He now knows how to kill the old self of anyone he comes into contact with and create them into what he wants them to be. For Haymitch, that ends up being a drunk. The only person Snow cannot effectively do this to is, of course, Katniss Everdeen, and she ends up destroying him at the end of Mockingjay.
Your hair looks lovely, darling.
Everyone at school wears it like this now, Grandpa.
Snow realizes that in turning people into what he wants them to be, he's creating far more effective propaganda and spreading his messages far more effectively than he could simply using posters, which we see quite a bit of in this novel as well. Suzanne Collins uses propaganda to blur the lines between what is real and what is not real, and this is a defining trait of Katniss and Peeta's relationship in the third novel, Mockingjay.
You love me. Real or not real?
Real.
The ability to shatter this lie and define these rules and lines between what is real and is not real, in Katniss and Peeta's case, love, and even in Snow's case, love, and in Haymitch's case, love being the real thing, is what ends up destroying the Capitol and destroying Snow. These lies cannot hold up to genuine people who refuse to swallow the bullshit or to change themselves into pieces of propagandic objects for the capital. Finnick and Katniss get to reclaim their narratives and tell the truth through the rebellion led by District 13, and even in some of their own propos, such as in this scene when Finnick Odair reveals what the capital's always done to him. And yet, is this not still propaganda? Collins would potentially make the case that no, it's not propaganda because it is the truth, it is genuine, but this stands in contrast to one of her earlier quotes that she begins Sunrise on the Reaping with. But I think it's important at this point to take into account that the term panem comes from a Latin phrase meaning bread and circuses. And Snow knows how to give his crowd bread and circuses because it allows you to lie to your crowd, to your people, and to control them. If you take away their bare necessities but provide them with a distraction, then they're still going to fall in line for you. The games, then, are framed as a tragic result of human nature and the original war, not as something which can be changed or ended. And this is really represented at the end of the novel when Haymitch Abernathy, who was on his victory tour, is very sad and nobody wants to talk to him because he's a depressed alcoholic who killed everybody, and Effie is the only one who stands next to him. Effie, like Haymitch at this point, is a product of the capital, and though she's the only one willing to show Haymitch any kind of kindness, she still says something along the lines of, however, the Hunger Games are inevitable and they are for a greater good, which of course deflates Haymitch. So in this sense, the Hunger Games themselves are real, but to the citizens of the capital, they may as well not be. They're basically television, they're scripted, they're made up because the citizens of the capital are so far removed from the actual effects, therefore turning something real into a product, into propaganda. The games are just good TV.
But I see no tears in Joanna's eyes. Joanna, you are angry. Tell me why.
I also want to point out that in this novel, Sunrise on the Reaping, panem is not at full strength, or at least they're not as good at controlling the narrative as they are later on in the series. Snow, just like Mussolini or Stalin or Hitler, used propaganda to project strength and convince people that the regime has no cracks. Even, well, Snow in this novel himself is sick and vomiting. Snow really only has one prominent scene in Sunrise on the Reaping, and it is very far removed from how we see him both in the Ballad, Songbirds, and Snakes and the original trilogy. When Haymitch Abernathy meets Snow in this novel, Snow has just gone through a round of potential food poisoning. We don't know the exact details, but it's highly suggested that Snow intentionally ate some poisoned oysters in order to convince one of his political enemies to do the same, and yet because Snow has a tolerance to these poisons, as we already know, he survives. And yet Snow, for as much as he's supposed to represent panem and the regime here, is still sick and vomiting up blood. He's vulnerable, and in this moment he exposes himself to Haymitch as vulnerable when this moment is meant to be a projection of strength. And yet, despite all this, the regime is still successful. It's sick, but it manages to keep people in line because people believe the propaganda. This is really highlighted at the end of the novel, when Haymitch, whose game footage has been tampered with and changed to reflect things that didn't actually happen, wonders why nobody is noticing the lies the capital is creating, and specifically, why nobody cares or does anything about it. And I think that this gets to an important note on the nature of propaganda and why people follow it, or why they can or cannot actually accurately identify what propaganda is. So here are a couple traits to identify propaganda that I think are also relevant to the novel. To identify propaganda, first you need to look for contradictions, either with previous narratives or your own experience. Not that your own experience is always going to be 100% reflective of what is or is not true. Again, anecdotal evidence is not the best evidence, but it's important to look at what you've actually gone through and see if the government is just straight up lying about it, or if the government is lying about things they previously have or have not said. Then the second thing you need to look for are expurgations or things being covered up, like literally or figuratively covered up. Also, identify who benefits from the potential propaganda. If whatever message you're supposed to believe has specific bent, who is benefiting from your belief in that message? And also recognize distractions. Snow and Panem are great at distractions, and so are, well, most governments in real life, so that you don't have time to think about whether or not what you're seeing is propaganda because you're too focused on something which is irrelevant. A good example of this that just happened this week, I would say, is the release of the JFK files. That's just a distraction to get people off of the topic of what is or actually is not real. And I know a lot of people say, it's a distraction, when there are in fact real problems out there, so be very careful with how far you're willing to run at this whole identifying distractions aspect, because it can lead you down very unhealthy conspiracy rabbit holes. But lastly, pay attention to how the regime treats existing media and narratives that they can't control. So things which are meant to exist outside of the government or outside the state, and which can question and expose the state, are usually going to be treated negatively by the state, which is trying to sell you propaganda. And yes, to be clear, it is very easy to identify propaganda on both sides of the political spectrum and from various figures and such, so I don't want to get too lost in the weeds about that, but I just know that there are a lot of things which you might personally agree with which could still classify as propaganda. But for example, I want to focus on something which recently has been a large subject of scrutiny and attack and ire, both from the government and people online, specifically for the reason that is being called propaganda, and that is public radio, specifically NPR News. If you're unaware, NPR News has been under a lot of attack from the current Trump administration and from Elon Musk specifically, and it's been accused of being state-sponsored media or state-run media, and therefore propaganda. And that is simply not true. If you aren't aware, NPR News gets most of its fundings from donations, either from individuals, from various companies, and then they get some of the revenue also from a law passed by Congress in 1967. However, there are not rules as to what NPR can or cannot say about the government given that they are receiving that funding. NPR is not propaganda or state media because it typically actually questions or subverts whatever the mainstream narrative of the government at the time is, and is not exclusively funded by the state. It also comes under attack from the state, like a lot, such as right now. And it's also free, supported by donations, therefore the listeners, and while it does get some funds from the state, it does not have a loyalty to the state or to its companies. For example, anytime they say something critical about a potential sponsor or donor, they will disclose that they still receive money from that sponsor or donor. They have laws about how transparent they need to be. NPR is publicly owned and doesn't make money. It doesn't have a profit motive, unlike something like CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or whatever. There is no incentive to sensationalize or lie. This is why actually so many people view public radio as boring.
Welcome to Thought. For your thoughts, I'm your host, Derry Merbles. Research shows that our listeners love jazz.
Because they don't spin things. It's just people talking about their own experiences. Or if you listen to a more localized version of NPR News, such as one dedicated to your state, it's going to be local news and is going to be run and staffed by local people. That's kind of the whole point. However, an example of something that I do feel is genuine propaganda we saw recently was this entire affair with Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and the selling of Teslas on the White House lawn. This is classic propaganda.
Hello, President Trump. Are you looking to buy or lease today?
Well, I'm going to buy.
Because there is a massive contradiction in Trump's views about Tesla versus his views about electric vehicles in general.
On day one, I will terminate Crooked Joe's ridiculous electric vehicle mandate. They're very expensive and they can all be made in China. What do you think of an electric car? Well, I like Elon, but, the car, and there's a place for electric cars, but you have to have other choices, too.
For years, Trump has dogged on and complained about electric vehicles and even Tesla and Elon Musk. But now that they're working in the government together, Trump's views about Tesla specifically have changed, and suddenly we all love electric vehicles. Musk is also a part of Trump's government, and the two of them benefit from sales of Teslas. Trump has also said that it is somehow illegal to boycott Tesla or to have illegal protests involving either Tesla or anything else. I feel it's pretty clear why this entire operation is a psyop, why it's propaganda. This Tesla debacle is just a circus to distract from the fact that Elon Musk and Doge are taking all of the bread from people who already don't have any. Another example of this is Trump's recent deal with Amazon TV, specifically he and Melania Trump's deal. In case you weren't aware, Amazon is paying $40 million in general, about half of which goes to Melania Trump explicitly for rights to create a documentary film about her life. Not only that, but as part of this deal, Amazon is now exclusively the only streamer that has the rights to The Apprentice, and they slap it right on the front of their homepage. Now, why is this a potential conflict of interest? Well, because Jeff Bezos is the second richest man in the world, second only to Elon Musk, and he attended Donald Trump's inauguration and has become very good friends with Donald Trump since winning the election. This is far more of an example of controlling the narrative than something like NPR. When you have media, a supposedly independent media company exclusively partnering with the President of the United States to produce content about him, making him and his family look good, I would say that yes, that is propaganda, especially taking into account that it is run by the second richest man in the world. This brings me back to Panem, which of course is a massive oligarchy. The state and business are 100% fused, as we're getting to see in the United States, whether it be with Tesla, Amazon, or Meta. Donald Trump has the three richest men, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg, all in his pocket and on his side. Additionally, Trump himself, like Snow, is rich. He's a millionaire and is appointed the richest man in the world to cut money from the government. This is very different from Mussolini-style strongman propaganda because it's significantly dumber, but that doesn't change the fact that it is in fact propaganda. Another great example would be during the George Floyd protest riots, whatever you want to refer to them as, when Trump had protesters cleared from Lafayette Square using tear gas so that he could take a picture outside of St. John's Church. Another great example of of a wonderful propo that Plutarch Heavensbee would have been very proud of, because Donald Trump himself has never been genuinely religious. See again the 2 Corinthians debacle.
And I asked Jerry and I asked some of the folks, because I hear this is a major theme right here, but 2 Corinthians, right? 2 Corinthians.
The protesters in this case are being 100% covered up. Trump benefits from the propaganda by showing off to his base that he is religious, and the photo op itself is a distraction from the social unrest, because everything is fine as long as your president has his Bible. The narrative they can't control, the protests against racial injustice, are the people being tear-gassed, pushed off the square, and hidden, or, in the case of 2025, now being arrested. This is eerily similar to the complete debacle that we see as a result of Haymitch Abernathy's Reaping in Sunrise on the Reaping, where there are protests and a boy is even shot, and yet Plutarch Heavensbee and the rest of the Capitol are able to just cut that footage out, get rid of it, and show what President Snow wants the people to see, which is the regime looking strong in the face of potential unrest, which of course doesn't even exist. And yet, despite all of this, Plutarch Heavensbee, just like a lot of people in real life, know that what they've done is project a lie, an image, and Plutarch is somewhat self-aware about this and even brings up to Haymitch and asks Haymitch why Haymitch doesn't do anything to overthrow the peacemakers even when he has the physical strength to do so. Why doesn't Haymitch and the others do something to stand up to this propaganda? This returns us to our previous idea that propaganda is always a projection of strength to hide weakness, corruption, and sickness, and yet propaganda only works if people choose to believe it. Independent figures and agencies exist to identify and critique propaganda. Keeping these institutions alive, holding them accountable, and studying these topics are all necessary in order to counter propaganda. So, in summary, don't let yourself become the propaganda piece. That is, I feel, Suzanne Collins' main point with this novel. Almost all of Suzanne Collins' characters, from Haymitch to Finnick to Silka to Snow to Luella/Lulu, are ruined because they become propaganda.
Katniss Everdeen is a symbol. They're mocking Jay. They think she's one of them. We need to show that she's one of us. She's engaged. Make everything about that. What kind of dress is she gonna wear? Floggings, fear, blanket coverage, shove it in their faces. Show them that she is one of us now.
One of the only exceptions is Katniss, and in a way Peeta, even though he's also put through a terrible process which turns him into a propaganda piece. You need to remember what is real, not just to you, but to the people around you and the things that you love.
Your favorite color is green. Is that real?
Yeah, that's real.
I want to end with a great exchange that comes at the end of Sunrise on the Reaping between the characters of Haymitch and Plutarch. Plutarch is again asking Haymitch why he didn't stand up and do something when he could have, and then tries to console Haymitch and make him feel better about the entire situation by suggesting that maybe someday, because they're part of a continuum, the two of them will be part of a rebellion which overthrows the Capitol. To which Haymitch responds, "You think you're a good person, don't you, Plutarch? You think you're a good guy because you told me about the sun and the berms, when what you really did is help create the Capitol's propaganda and broadcast it to the country. 49 kids died for it, but you gave it the old Heavensbee spin, and in the propo, you're some kind of hero." Plutarch takes a moment to answer this before he responds with, "I'm no one's idea of a hero, Haymitch, but at least I'm still in the game."
One woman's opinion. Who's next?